Well, welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So this presentation is on viewing fatness through a social justice lens, particularly in the context of higher ed. And my name is Luke Killian, he, him pronouns. I'm a master's student in the higher ed program at UNCG. Okay, so just a warning at the very beginning, the presentation has a lot of content and plenty of it can be raw because it's dealing with oppression of fat people specifically, but other intersecting identities. If this is something you're not able to be here for today, I have a couple of introductory slides, so you have plenty of time to click away. So here's what we're going to talk about today. Like I said, brief introduction, then I'm going to talk about some sources of where fat stigma comes from. Then I'll talk about examples of what anti-fat discrimination looks like, and then move on to moving forward and what this looks like in our field. So just to start, my position, I am not a fat person. I'm a thin or straight size person. So just to establish that I don't personally experience this type of discrimination, I will include some fat content creators at the very end if you want to check them out for some more information. I've been studying this topic for about 9 years now. I came to size acceptance and body justice through being a transgender person and struggling with a bad relationship to eating. And just a note on language. So I use the word fat a lot in this presentation. That is purposeful. I'm trying to normalize its use as respectful, descriptive language. I'm going to avoid euphemisms like curvy or big boned because those are offensive. But I do want to acknowledge that the word fat can still carry shame for some people, but I want y'all to kind of know why I'm using it. So here's some questions to start. In a context of higher ed, I just want us to think about, do we study retention rates for fat students? Do our institutions include weight in their non-discrimination policies? And do our campus climate surveys include body size as a variable? Why or why not? In my experience, the answer is usually no. So I'd like us to think about that as we're going through this presentation. Okay, sources of fat stigma. This unfortunately needs to be a very surface level gloss due to the time we have. I'm going to touch on some historical background, scientific misconceptions, and then how our current culture reinforces these beliefs. I'm focusing on Western culture because I believe that that is the origin of a lot of what we see in terms of size discrimination in the US today. Not saying that other cultural backgrounds are less important, but I think this is more relevant to understanding this particular discrimination. So with Greek culture, you see this cognitive separation of body and soul, but specifically the body is seen as undermining the best efforts of the soul. Ancient Greek culture also developed this four humors concept. We see it then tied into racist science in the 1700s. So the belief was that if there was an excess of black bile, it caused both dark skin and body fat. So this is the beginning we see of this dichotomy of black equals fat and white equals thin. Bile theory also combined with cranial theory at the time, and it posited that white skulls with a receded mouth and advanced forehead indicated white people were designed to think rather than eat. More so than that, you're seeing this construction of the bodily need to eat as primitive and uncivilized. So the mind was seen as the master of the body, morally superior, closer to God, with white people as the race most capable of reason. By the time we get to the so-called Enlightenment, these sort of divine superiority concepts are replaced with, heavy quotes here, objectivity. So Amy Farrell wrote a book called Fat Shame that I really appreciate, and she says, within the political, social, and economic upheaval of the 19th century, new justifications for the vastly unequal hierarchical arrangements and oppressions emerged to replace the old ones. The rising institutions of science and medicine now provided objective evidence of natural inferiority among women, the poor, and colonized people. I say this because as we get into modern medicine and science, it's important to understand the historical basis of using these fields to justify discrimination. And this is what I believe is the thesis from Amy's book. She says, the fat body, I argue, became seen as unable to manage the modern world precisely because of its association with inferior bodies, or to use the language of obesity experts of the time, the primitive, the abnormal, and the uncivilized. So this is to say that the interconnections between racism, sexism, and anti-fatness run deep. So let's bring it more current. The obesity epidemic, I'm sure we've all heard this phrase. The terminology war on obesity is attributed to C. Everett Koop. He used to be a Surgeon General, but after he was a Surgeon General, he got involved with the Shape Up America campaign. And it's through this campaign that he made this announcement of his war on obesity. It is worth noting that Shape Up America was sponsored with at least $2 million from Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig alone. He also worked with researchers to publish work that supported a claim that obesity killed 300,000 Americans a year. And this is something that at least I've seen a lot. It's similar statistics. Obesity kills 300,000 people a year. It kills 400,000 people a year. These are very alarming statistics, and I want us to talk about where they come from. So on the one hand, it comes from the Shape Up America campaign. The CDC also published a similar statistic in 2004. They said obesity-related deaths were 400,000 in the United States per year. When they published this report, it drew a lot of criticism. There's scandal behind why the report was created that unfortunately I can't get into, but the backlash prompted an internal review, and the CDC had a whole new set of authors, better methodology, newer data, and they reduced their estimate by 94%, which is pretty severe. So this wasn't a small, oh, oopsie, we didn't get quite all of our data right. This is a massive change in the estimate of how many people die from weight-related causes. The BMI, we have all heard of the BMI. I want to talk a little bit about where it comes from. So it was created by Adolf Quetelet, who notably was not a doctor. He was not a scientist, he was a sociologist, and his formula that he developed is the same one that we use today for the BMI. The formula has not changed at all. So when he created it for the purpose of identifying what he called the perfect person or the average man. So this wasn't about judging individual health, it was about looking at statistical averages with racist motivations. So here's a quote from Quetelet. He says, quote, "If the average man were completely determined, we might consider him as the type of perfection, and everything differing from his proportion or condition would constitute deformity or disease or monstrosity." Which is very strong language. So he was basing his measurements on white men, and that's what he deemed as the correct person. Everything else was disease or monstrosity. This formula was adopted around the 1980s in the United States, but notably in 1998, it was changed. The cutoffs were changed. So today, the cutoff is 25 BMI is overweight, 30 or higher is obese. The cutoff was actually higher before 1998. The reason they changed it, this did not have scientific or medical motivations. I mean, of course it couldn't, because the BMI is not based on science. So it changed because the United States National Institutes of Health, their obesity task force was pressured to align with the World Health Organization, who had lowered their cutoff to this 25. The reason WHO did that was from pressure from the International Obesity Task Force, which I could not believe this was a real thing. It sounds like a comic book, but it's actually there. The International Obesity Task Force was founded and funded by Hoffman La Roche and Abbott Laboratories, which are weight loss drug companies. So the reason that you are classified as overweight has less to do with science and medicine and more to do with this chain of political and economic pressure. So I want to talk about this concept we have that obesity is increasing at epidemic rates. So here's a report from Harvard from, I believe, 2020. And they say that in 1990, obese adults made up less than 15% of the population in most of the US. By 2010, 36 states had obesity rates of 25% or higher. So from 1990 to 2010, we're seeing this 10% increase in obesity in the population, which seems quite alarming. In 1998, the cutoff for the BMI was lowered so that overnight, 10% of the population went up in a category. It seems to me like there's a connection here. The report makes no mention of it. It's very rarely discussed. The report goes on to say, while US obesity rates have overall stayed steady since 2003. I want to pause here because how often do we hear obesity rates have overall stayed steady for over a decade? That's not what gets publicized. We hear more of the panic, it's increasing at exponential rates. And then they kind of gloss over that and move on to, but disparities persist in non-Hispanic, Black, Hispanic, and Mexican American adults. Well, the formula was measured off of white men. So of course disparities exist for populations that are not white. And the final thing I want to point out about that is if you see this US News and World Report graph, I just want to point out that on the left side of the graph, we see the numbers go from 30 to 42, not 0 to 100%. So the graph has been specifically manipulated to make obesity rates look like it's a more severe increase. We fight obesity not because obesity is inherently a problem, but because fighting it is lucrative. These are my words. So the US diet and weight loss market is worth about $72 billion every year. Okay, so scientific misconceptions. On the right here, I have some common myths or beliefs that we have about weight. They are that overweight and obesity lead to early death, overweight and obesity lead to disease, we're gaining weight epidemic rates, weight loss improves health and longevity, you control what you weigh, anyone can keep lost weight off if they try hard enough, thinner is more attractive, and we can trust the experts to provide accurate information. I've already gone over two of these, the we can trust the experts myth and the epidemic rates myth. We'll touch on a few more of these, but I do want to point out that these are beliefs, they are not facts. Okay, so this is probably where I should have started my presentation. What even is obesity? The quick answer is that it's complicated. It depends on what studies you look at, but there are as many as 6 to 59 different types of obesity. And when I say types, I'm talking about the web of factors that have resulted in that person's body size, whether it be genetics, hormones, stress, et cetera. And we don't really have a good way of measuring body fat. The BMI is about 50% accurate. So we don't really have a way of defining that in a doctor's office conveniently. Again, kind of continue, body weight is complicated. It's influenced by more than 100 factors with 300 interconnections between these factors. A lot of studies that have looked at adults who were adopted or twins have concluded that weight is about 70% accounted for by genetics, which means that your body size is more heritable than almost any other condition, including breast cancer, schizophrenia, and heart disease. So kind of going back to this idea of you control what you weigh. Does dieting work? I would say yes, in the sense that it grosses billions a year. I would say no in terms of like long-term change in your body size. So about 90 to 90% of people who lose weight on a diet regain it within 3 years. And as we're aware, this creates this pattern of what we call weight cycling. So you diet, you lose weight, you gain it back. You diet again, you lose weight, you gain it back. Yo-yo dieting is connected to negative health outcomes. So a few of the side effects of weight cycling would be an increase in all-cause mortality, an increase in cardiovascular disease mortality, and an increase in coronary heart disease mortality. I think it's interesting to note these are the things we usually blame fat itself for and don't really critique like what are the social pressures put on fat people and how might that result in behaviors that create some of these outcomes. So this is just sort of emphasize again, 5% is how many people who succeed in maintaining weight loss over about 5 to 10 years, which is pretty low. I think because weight loss is so ineffective and dieting is so ineffective that there are a lot of marketing strategies used to still sell the products associated with it. So these are just a few marketing strategies I'm pointing out. One would be just renaming it. So it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle change, or it's not a diet, it's biohacking, or it's really about the weight, or it's really about your health. The weight loss is just an awesome side effect. These are all diet and weight loss products that have just been repackaged. One technique is blaming individuals. So that's what I have the picture over here, kind of like a pull yourself up by the bootstraps, like this idea that the widespread failure of diet and weight loss strategies is clearly because the 95% of people just didn't do the right thing, but will sell you the real miracle cure, or they didn't do the right thing correctly. They just didn't try hard enough. One technique is to lift up the exception. So for the people who they do keep the weight off, or the people whose weight was mostly influenced by lifestyle factors, we hyper focus on those people and say, well, they did it, so why shouldn't this apply to all the rest of the 95% of you? And then finally, just grand promises. You can lose weight in a few days, easy and fast. My sort of litmus test that I got from a podcast that I'll share with you guys is that if we actually found a way to safely lose fat quickly, easily, and over the long term, the news would be everywhere. Like I'm talking Newsweek, New York Times, Associated Press. So if you're only hearing about it in a women's magazine or on Dr. Oz, it's a marketing strategy. It's not real. And then sort of a caveat really quick, I just want to acknowledge that there are barriers to choice. When we talk about like, why don't you just choose to get thinner? There's a lot more than goes into that. So we could talk about systemic social barriers, having the financial means to hire a nutritionist or anything like that. And also, I mean, the USDA exists for a couple reasons. One of them is promoting agribusiness. Sometimes what's best for agriculture is not what is best for public health. So, you know, choice is not trivial, I guess, is what I'm getting at. Fatness has been historically constructed as antithetical to personal and societal advancement. Fatness represents greed, disease, racial inferiority, reframed also as genetic inferiority, and more. We rarely give fatness the respect of being considered an oppressed social identity. We just view it as inherently inferior. So when we fight obesity and fatness, what is it exactly that we are fighting? Okay, current culture. So here's a photo series I really love by Lakan Ogumbanwo, where she's juxtaposing objects similar to fat bodies with a fat human body. I think it's what I like about it is it helps us challenge what it is about fat inherently that we object to, because we have these objects that are not coded as human body. Okay, so Dr. Cooper in '07, she pointed out what's called the headless fatty phenomenon. I bring this up just so those of you who haven't heard of it before can kind of keep your eyes out when you see imagery of fat people. So she noticed with a lot of the like obesity epidemic news and blogs, there would be pictures of a fat person who was seemingly photographed without their consent or knowing they're being photographed and their head's not in the picture. So sort of thinking about what function does this picture serve? So it's like, in my opinion, it's exploiting a fat person to push a message that harms fat people. But an activity that might be, I mean, I've tried it and it's very telling. If you try to Google search for an image of a fat person, try to find one where you see their face and they're dressed nicely. They're not depicted as a joke. They are not exercising and they're not eating or pictured with food. So I might recommend trying this in your free time. Can you find a picture like this? And how easy was it to find a picture like this? And if you do, how fat is the person in the picture? TV and movies, of course, is like not a good story. Fatness is used as a metaphor for pretty much any failure, societal failure, personal failure. Fat suits are very commonly used. The problem with fat suits is that not only are we not paying an actual fat person to play a character, and more, I'll share more on the fat earning gap later, but you're paying a thin person in a fat suit to portray a stereotyped caricature of a fat person. And reality TV is also a mess, which doesn't surprise anybody. I mean, we have shows like The Biggest Loser, My 600-Pound Life. I think these are popular for a couple reasons. People will tune into them to pity fat people or marvel at the physicality of very fat bodies, like a circus sideshow, elevate themselves through comparison, and reap the satisfaction of watching fat people suffer from and reject their own fatness. I think there's this condescending pleasure in watching fat people's journey. These shows sell because they play into our negative beliefs about fatness. Okay, so let's talk about examples of discrimination. I've been talking a lot, so I'm gonna take a drink of water. I'm sorry this is a mile a minute. It's like a fire hose, but you know, I tried to cut it down. The mistreatment of fat people should be called discrimination, not motivation. I think shame is a poor motivator anyway, so I'm arguing that the real seed of our critique needs to be our systemic and social discrimination towards fat people, not fat people themselves. Here's what we'll go over in this section. The graphic I've included, that's from Ash of the Fatlit podcast. She created this to illustrate that the the size a person is will impact the discrimination they experience. So these aren't supposed to be immutable categories, but more to say that there's some difference here. I wrote down some common stereotypes of fat people. There are some that are obviously nasty, like greedy, unhygienic, lazy, sloppy, miserable, lonely, gross. And then there are some that seem nice, but are condescending, and I would argue just as harmful, like fat people are jolly, they're unambitious, they're simple-minded, stupid, funny, that sort of thing. So I'm not going to play this video, but I included some quotes that I pulled out from it. It's a good example of arguments and rhetoric that position thin as better, and that this should be the goal for everybody. So in order for an argument like this to work, you have to position fat people as one of three things. Either they are ignorant, they just don't understand what to do to get thin. They are impotent, they're trying to get thin, but they aren't good at it, or disobedient, they are just willfully doing nothing and staying fat. So I have two quotes from the video that I think illustrate some of these points. So the woman in the video, she says, quote, "When I see overweight people and obese people, I do try to give them the benefit of the doubt. I know that there are people out there that are trying to be healthier. I know that they do care, but they don't know what to do." So this idea of they just don't get it. They're just ignorant. If they knew better, they would be thin. And then she says, quote, "I don't hate fat people. I want to help them become healthier." Which to me goes to the impotent piece. Like, I need to help them. They need my help to get thinner. They can't do it on their own. For me, these ways of framing fat people infantilize them. So they're an object to be pitied and not an adult with full agency. But I think they're easily accepted because they call up these stereotypes of fat people as stupid, incompetent, lazy, or lacking in self-control. So what's the impact of weight-based bias? And here's a couple of different studies that are specifically looking at what are the outcomes of discrimination based on weight. Some examples I wanted to pull out would be increased blood pressure, stress, binge eating, symptoms of depression, decreased motivation for exercise. As mentioned, shame is not motivating, decreased quality of life, that sort of thing. I think what is interesting about these is, again, these are things that we tend to blame fat itself for. You're depressed because you're fat. Your blood pressure is high because you're fat, and we're not looking at the confounding variable of discrimination. Specifically on social contact, researchers have found that individuals with large bodies elicit strong feelings of disgust and a strong desire for increased social distance among individuals with thin bodies. This is particularly salient for us, I think, during COVID-19, because we've all experienced touch deprivation and the stress from that to some degree. So this is, I think, one aspect of me bringing this up is that if we harbor beliefs that are negative about fatness, if we have feelings of disgust towards our own or others' fatness, we can't really hide that in a professional setting with a student. You may think that you can put on a professional shield, but I don't really believe that that's the case. And I included a small sampling of microaggressions. Of course, there's more, but here's just a few. Let's see, one would be like talking negatively about your own fat or weight gain. So like disparaging jokes about the COVID-15 that you've gained. What that communicates to other people is that you're trying your best to not look like anyone in the room who's bigger than you are. And one would be like unsolicited advice of any variety. So like words of encouragement given to a fat person exercising. The assumption there is, of course, you're exercising to get thin because that's what you're supposed to do. And go you trying to look differently than you do now. Okay, and I included some what I would consider blatant examples of anti-fat bias. There's really low representation of fat people in media or history that's respectful. I think an example would be like President Taft. The only thing we know about him is he got stuck in a bathtub. We don't really know that he's like the only person to hold the highest offices in the judicial and executive branches of government. Denial of right to adopt was something that really shocked me. So something that does happen is if a fat couple is trying to adopt, the assumption is, well, look at your size. You obviously don't know how to take care of yourself. So how could you take care of a child, and not letting those people adopt? Here is examples of objects, physical spaces that are communicating on a very tactile level, you don't belong here, right? So furniture, chairs of almost any kind, seating of almost any kind, a lot of medical equipment. So blood pressure bands are the wrong shape and they tend to give inaccurate readings, things like that. In education, fat students show no statistically significant differences in intelligence or achievement test scores, yet receive significantly lower grades in middle school, community college, and university after controlling for demographic variables, intelligence, personality, and well-being. So to me, this is the stereotypes of fat people as lazy, incompetent, and stupid seeping into grading practices. And employment is also not good. So fat people are less likely to be hired than thin people, regardless of qualifications. This is particularly seen in people-facing jobs. So the thinking from the company being, well, your appearance doesn't really represent us well, so we're not going to hire you for this front desk position. Lower starting salaries, being ranked as less qualified. So people make negative inferences about fat people in the workplace due to these negative stereotypes, and these stereotypes of laziness, lack of self-discipline, and being less competent, they are shown to impact wages, promotions, and disciplinary actions. And things that are more expensive. I have a list of things here. Something that I wanted to underline was healthcare. We often talk about how taxpayers are paying more for the healthcare for obese persons. So people classified as obese are estimated at spending an extra $1,400 per year on medical spending. The assumption is, well, that's because you're less healthy because you're fat. And the increase in medical spending is likely due to a complex blend of factors. So some doctors will refuse to see patients above a certain BMI, which forces people to go out of network, which is expensive. Often doctors will ignore a fat patient's symptoms and just chalk it up to obesity, which forces them to seek second opinions to find a correct diagnosis or someone who will take them seriously. And fat patients are also more likely to avoid going to the doctor due to stigma encountered there, so they often don't get care until problems have developed into something that's more expensive. All of this to say, fat people have more in common than just weight. So when we look at data about fat people, it's worth considering these confounding variables, not just, oh, there's a negative outcome, it must be because you're fat. All right, I wanted to talk about fatness and morality. I think this is the last part of this section, and then we'll go to the moving forward section. So this, for me, it's a little more than just thin is good, fat is bad, although that's part of it. I wanted to talk about the natural body. I think some anti-fat rhetoric calls on this romantic idea of an archetypal human, or this idea that if we all just ate and exercised the way our ancestors did, we would all transform into like this Paleolithic, toned, thin white man, which is just not real life. I have nothing against paleo or raw diets. I'm sure they have benefit. I think culturally, the appeal of them relies on framing fat bodies as representative of packaged and refined foods, and that's the real issue in my eyes. So in other words, I believe that fat people represent our anxieties about the dangers of a modern industrialized world. So similar to the medieval South or Make America Great Again, these are nostalgic movements that rely on rosy notions of the past to relieve anxiety about change in the present. And kind of to continue on that point, and I also hear this as a transgender person, lots of arguments about some bodies being more natural, and I think that's a way of framing an opinion as a fact. So it's not just me that thinks this body's unnatural, it's just how nature's supposed to be. So you're kind of pushing the responsibility for your opinion away from yourself. And then there'll be a lot of like, well, this is just genetic mutation or mental illness, not how nature is supposed to work. And I think this is not reflective of the natural world. It's aspirational and based on a value system. So just because one aspect of the natural world is less effective at some biological imperative, so in terms of like fat people fleeing from danger, for example, doesn't mean that this doesn't or shouldn't exist. If the natural world has any rules, it's diversity and change, not perfection. So I think this idea of an optimized ideal body free of defect sounds an awful lot like eugenics. And I also want to note that a lot of these natural diets or natural lifestyles, they may be great, but we are so many thousands of years away from the advent of agriculture. We just don't have a personal conception of what this is even like. Like, this is a fantasy, not our current reality. There are very few people today who live outside of agriculture or industry. When we judge someone's fatness, we're also judging their moral value. So I don't think in our society and cultural context, you cannot split fat judgment from morality judgment. So if you say, I don't think fat people are bad, I'm only judging their health, that doesn't really work because health is not a morally neutral concept. I think we've seen that with COVID-19, where someone gets sick, they get a positive test result, and it's not just, oh, what can I do to help, but it's what did they do wrong? And I think that comes from a fearful place of, if I just do the right thing, then I can avoid disease, I can avoid death, I can avoid social rejection. And I think we see that with fatness too. So in like obesity alarmist discourse, fat and sick are seen as synonyms. So if you're fat, you got sick, and you must have done something wrong to get sick. And then I think it gets really tricky to support fat bodies because you've got this sort of panicked idea of, if you support them, you have blood on your hands by encouraging rising levels of deadly obesity. I want to talk about diets a little bit. I think it's a similar point. We attach moral value to certain foods or eating habits. And I think by labeling specific foods as good or bad, the leap to declaring people who consume bad foods as bad people becomes very easy. And fat people are assumed to be the primary consumers of unhealthy foods. Um, I don't think diets are generally a neutral quest for health. Not saying there's anything like wrong with them if that's what you want to do, but they are strongly motivated by a desire to look different. Research has found that people are more motivated to limit their caloric intake and exercise if they believe that they will look, quote, better. When they stop believing that their appearance will change, they lose motivation. In brief, for this section, I think that we understand that the way we treat fat people isolates and harms them, and we want to avoid those outcomes. So we choose to believe that fat people have earned their fate, and that with the right behavioral changes, we can avoid the same. Fatness is a site of anxieties about death, disability, and social rejection. Is losing weight or having fitness goals bad? No, it's your body, it's your rules. Of course not. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. What I am challenging is the following assumptions: that all fat people are not healthy because they are fat, that health is a moral obligation, that weight and health are, one, in a direct relationship to each other, and two, the direct result of personal choices, and that any thin person is healthier, happier, more capable, etc., than any fat person. So let's talk about moving forward. What do we do now? What does this look like in higher ed? I think a good place to start is ourselves. So when you look at the fat on your own body, what words come to mind and what emotions come to mind? What does being fat mean to you? And I've included a picture of a fat woman who's driving with some pictures around, or some words around her. So when you see a fat person, what comes to mind emotionally? What words really jump out at you? How fat is too fat? So I've been asked questions before about, like, what about very fat people? What about quality of life? I think this is tricky as student affairs professionals because in a way our jobs ask us to make judgments about how well a student's life is going so we can respond to perceived problems. And I think the reason this approach gets used on fat people is because of this pervasive belief that fat is a choice. So we don't approach fatness as what it is, which is a mostly immutable part of a person's existence and a social category that's oppressed. I also want us to bear in mind that our perceptions about very fat people are often determined by the stereotype portrayals we get in the media, not through people we actually know. So to this point, I just want to ask, how do we decide for another person if their life is worth living as it is? And I'll just leave that there. At what size do we withhold respect and support? And I would ask, what's the intended purpose of doing so? So, like with other identities, think about social pressures that say that people need to get rid of as much fatness, gayness, blackness, etc., as possible in order to have success, happiness, health, etc. And what sort of working relationship can we realistically form with someone if we also experience disgust or rejection towards their body? So your students who are very fat have experienced a lifetime of this discrimination, so are likely very attuned to those very small little body language cues that indicate that you don't feel comfortable with their physical presence. And that will likely come across in your interactions with them. And I would ask how you think this impacts their experience with college. So if my advisor is always leaning away from me because I'm very fat and they're not comfortable with that, how are things going to go for me? A piece of advice would just be that we all do our own research on diet, weight loss, and fitness science. I'm going to recommend some books at the end because combing through all this ourselves, it's difficult on purpose, right? So there are people who have made this easy for us. I would caution us to question the author's credentials. A lot of people who will write some very famous reports are not experts on obesity. Funding sources, limitations, methodology. I think we've gone over that pretty well, that there's a lot of confounding variables that just aren't really considered in a lot of studies, and that's worth noting. Okay, so the next step would be behavior, challenging our own behavior. So I would sort of ask if our go-to water cooler conversation is our latest diet, what's the impact of that? And when we talk about our own weight, what are we communicating to others? So unfortunately, we don't have time for me to do like an interactive piece, but I'll give 3 examples and then some possible responses for you all to consider. So one example would be a student or a colleague loses weight. How do you respond? One option would be to congratulate and compliment them, tell them how good they look, how much better they must feel. You could start rumors. Is it for the wedding? Are they sick? You can check in with them in general, just see how they're doing. Or you could ignore it, like mind your own business. I won't say which one is right or wrong. I'll say from my experience of someone who I had a bad relationship to eating and that was tied up to a lot of things. And so I lost a lot of weight. And so being at a really low place in life and having people say, oh, you look so good, didn't help me in that situation. Okay, so a student says some variation of like, I'm so fat, what do? You can either deny it, you can say, no, you're not, and disagree with them. You could go aggressive chaos mode and say, so what are you going to do about it? You can reflect back what you're hearing. So does body size matter to you a lot, or this idea bothers you? Or you can just ignore the comment and move on. And my last example is if a student wants to work on a weight loss goal with you, what do? You could either refer them to the recreation office on campus. You could dig a little to try to find out why the student is bringing this up. Why is this a goal that they have? You could acknowledge that you're not professionally qualified to work on weight loss goals, or you could agree to coach them through weight loss. Okay, so my final section, this is people to follow, things to check out if you want to learn more. Here's some resources, voices from fat people. I do want to note that not everyone in the following slides identifies as fat, but all of them are engaged in body justice in some way. Photography for me, I think has been really important. So the Adipositivity Project has been run for I don't even know how long. It's been over a decade easily at this point by Substantia Jones. And Sugar McD, pictured right, is a queer photographer who mostly does portraiture of fat people. And here is some of Substantia Jones' artwork. I think something that she does, which is really cool, is she does portraits of fat people in love, which challenges some of these stereotypes that fat people are lonely or miserable. Yoga, we actually have some great local resources. So Jessamine Stanley is based out of Durham. She has a website, so check her out. There's her handle underneath her portrait. We also have the Guilford Foundation in Greensboro. They run a queer and fat positive yoga on Instagram Live called Rainbow Rainbow Yoga Live, so that's something to check out. There are too many books to put in here. I know this is a lot of information, but books I have found are some of the best resources for this type of information. Google is not very reliable. Fearing the Black Body or the Racial Origins of Fat Phobia. If you're particularly interested in the intersection of race and anti-fat bias, this book just came out, like 2019, so that's a great one. There's one by Aubrey Gordon, who is the person behind Your Fat Friend. She came out with a book last year. I have it right here. This is not paid. This is not paid at all. I actually haven't read it, but I'm very excited to read it, and it just came out. So there's a lot of really cool work that is coming out on the topic. If you want me to send you this reading list, I'd be more than happy to. And I really like podcasts. So Friend of Marilyn has been going on for a very long time. So that's kind of like your old school staple of the fat lib field. Maintenance Phase just came out and I highly recommend it. It is extremely well researched. Yeah, it's just a great show. And the fat lip is actually, I think she's phasing out. So it's just archival at this point. And that's what I have. Thank you very much. There is my email. So feel free to contact me if you want to know more. And does anyone have any questions? I know we're a little low on time. I know the chat's been blowing up, but I haven't. I've been talking so much. Okay, I see some recommendations in the chat. Awesome. Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been great. I'm mostly impressed with myself at keeping it under 50 minutes. Cool. Thank you, everybody. Well, I hope you all have beautiful Fridays. Enjoy the weekend, enjoy the weather. Oh my gosh, so many nice things. Thank you, everybody. Yes, Alicia's Instagram. Yep. Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, I believe she was a UNCG counseling grad, so shout out to UNCG. Sweet. Well, I'm for real about emailing me, so I think Caitlin can, it looks like you're gonna close us out, but yeah, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lou. You've had a lot of really great things shared in the chat, so it's really cool to look through. But I thank you all so much for attending.
You muted.
Great. I'm just saying thank you, Lou. I did drop a link in the chat, so thank you all for coming and attending. This link will take you to the evaluation for this session. There's also an evaluation for general hot topics that we'd appreciate you all filling out so we can keep making hot topics bigger and better every year. Okay, thank you all.